if you could tell us a bit about it, please, Laura, at the top.
Sure. Thank you for having me on.
No problem at all.
Daughters of Night is set in London in the 18th century in 1782. And it opens with my main character, Caro, who is a sort of society beauty who is in an unhappy 18th century marriage. And the beginning of the book, she's at the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, which were kind of a sort of a cross between like a theme park and a circus and a kind of dinner and dancing venue all in one. And she slips off to the darker parts of the garden for a secret assignation. And whilst there, she discovers the body of a murdered woman. And when it shortly emerges that this woman is not the high society lady that everyone at first presumes she is, but rather a high-class prostitute, the authorities lose interest in the case. But for various reasons, Caro cannot let this murder go. And so she decides that she's going to solve the crime herself. And she hires a thief taker in order to help her with the investigation. And so that because there are parts of London that she can't, as a woman, cannot go to. The brothels and the gin shops, and so there's a kind of two-handed investigation into this murder that takes you into all the different facets of Georgian society at that time.
When doing the two-handed narrative, did you write them like in sections? Like, did you do all one and then the other, or is it like alternate?
No, I don't really have that sort of brain. I have to write the book in a linear fashion. I greatly admire these people who just wake up one morning and go, I'm going to write a scene at the end of the book today, and then I'm going to write a scene from the middle the next day. I could not do that. I wouldn't know how.
When it comes to Caro's character, of course, she's got an important role in Blood and Sugar as well, you first spoke. Yeah. But why did you decide to go with her and not
well, in my first book, which was set in 18th century Deptford and was about the slave trade, it was called Blood and Sugar. And the main character in that book was Harry Corsham, who is Caro's husband. And by the necessity of the plot, in that book, most of the suspects of the murder were the crew of the officers on a slaving ship. And just by virtue of the nature of that plot, most of the characters in that book were men. And I really wanted this second book to be a book about women's lives in Georgian England. And so I very much wanted to have a woman main character. Caro I fell in love with when I was writing Blood and Sugar, and I really wanted to give her more scenes than the plot of that book justified. And but I'm quite a ruthless editor, and I didn't really feel they had earned their place in the book. So instead, I thought I'd give her a book of her own. And what I also wanted to do was, as I alluded to in my opening, the Harry and Caro's marriage is not an especially happy one, for various reasons. And in Blood and Sugar, I explore that a bit, but it's all from Harry's perspective. And I wanted to show the other side of the story, because every marriage has two sides. And I felt that it would be wrong for my readers to accept Harry's account in its entirety. I wanted to give Caro her voice in that disagreement as well.
What did that allow you to do in different angles that you couldn't do if you had done it the other way around?
Yes, definitely, because if you talk to two of your friends who are getting divorced, they're going to have a totally different perspective upon the same event. And it's usually not that one person is lying, it's that these things are very subjective. Fault is a subjective thing, and where a marriage breaks down it often has, not always, but it often has more than one person responsible. And so I thought that this would be a much more interesting way of approaching their marriage, which is not, it's not a main driver of the plot, but it's there in the background, and it contributes greatly to why both Harry and Caro do the things that they do in terms of the murder investigations that they set out upon.
In the book, there's a thief taker, which of course is a 18th century thing, because back then there was the Bow Street Runners, so it was a new force, really. So what was it like researching Bow Street Runners?
It was fascinating, because the criminal justice system at that time was incredibly patchy and corrupt, and most Bow Street the Bow Street Runners were a new innovation, and a very welcome one, because there hadn't really been much of a police force at all. There was just like the Watch and some constables before that. But even the Bow Street Runners, they didn't really investigate crimes. If someone was killed and there was a witness, then they'd go and arrest the man who was the murderer, or the person, or the thief, or whatever. But if there weren't any witnesses, normally there wasn't a great deal that they could do. And the magistrates who directed the Bow Street Runners were notoriously corrupt, so rich people could buy their way out of justice, and as usual it was the poor people that got into trouble. People would take bribes to turn evidence if they wanted a conviction. It was all very sort of shady, and indeed in some of the original sources, when you hear a writer writing about a magistrate who didn't take bribes, this was held up to be like an exemplary and surprising thing. He was honest most of the time, they'd say, as though that was to be kind of applauded rather than the reverse.
That must have allowed you to do lots of really fun things with the plot, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so Peregrine Child was also a character from Blood and Sugar, and in Blood and Sugar he was the magistrate of Deptford, and a magistrate exactly like the ones I've described, not the good sort, the ones who would take bribes and are a little bit shady. But even though Child he's far from an angel, but I think ultimately his heart is in the right place. And following the events of Blood and Sugar, in Daughters of Night, he has lost his job as a magistrate. And so he has set himself up as a thief taker. And thief takers were a kind of 18th century private detective. So because the Bow Street Runners and the forces of law and order weren't really any good, people would hire a thief taker if they had been robbed, or someone had been murdered, or their daughter had been raped. They would hire a thief taker to find the person responsible. And again, thief takers were notoriously corrupt, but they were also often the only sort of recourse to justice that people had.
Prostitution as a plot line is really emphasized by the 18th century, because like you open the book saying that it's a rite of passage with a quote. Yeah,
it was an incredibly large part of the Georgian economy. Like some estimates, 1 in 5 female Londoners had participated in prostitution at some point in their lives. And it was also, women moved in and out of it as well. That they would, when times were good, their husband was earning good money, they would stop being a prostitute. But if things got bad again, they might go back to it. And it was very much, people think about prostitutes from like the 18th and 19th century as sort of women starving in a doorway and the sort of poor unfortunates, and that there was definitely that side of prostitution was definitely true, but a lot of women could earn very, very good money, which was why it was such an attractive profession, but it was also incredibly dangerous. So you could earn, as a reasonably pretty prostitute, you could earn 5 guineas a night as a prostitute. And that's the equivalent of the wage for a year for a housemaid, which was often the only other occupation that a working class woman of that era could do. So you can see it's kind of a no-brainer. You can earn in one night what you earn in a year. So it was hardly surprising that was an attractive proposition to a lot of women. But of course, it was dangerous. It was horrible work. You could catch disease, and of course, male violence, which is something that I explore a lot in the book.
Has Alex disappeared?
Yes.
Oh no. I was really enjoying listening to that. I've got a question on the board, on the message. So I'll ask you that while we're waiting for Alex to come back. Can you tell us about your Daughters of Night cocktail that you made? Because you had an epic sort of series of tweets about gin.
About gin, yes. Gin does feature in Daughters of Night. It's an absolute favourite drink of Peregrine Child, who drinks rather too much for his own good. And I mean, I think most people have heard about the 18th century gin craze, and how it became a real issue because people were drinking themselves to death by drinking adulterated gin, and there were a whole series of gin acts passed to try and crack down on the illegal gin sellers. So gin's ever present in Georgian London, and yes, I did do some tweets about some of the more entertaining aspects of gin. And one of my favourite things is that because it was illegal for people to sell gin without very expensive licenses, lots of people set up as illegal gin sellers, and the government and the magistrates paid informants, gin informants, I think we'll call them, and these gin informants would go and buy gin from people and then testify that that's what they'd done so that they could be arrested. And this very enterprising gentleman called Dudley Bradstreet decided that he came up with a very clever ruse whereby he could sell gin to people who were very eager to buy it, but they would never see his face and he would never see theirs, so it would defeat the informants. And what he did was he rented a house, and he had attached to the shutter of the window of this house, he had a relief, a wooden carving of a cat holding out its paw like that. And people would come up to the cat and they would go, "Puss, puss, are you there, puss?" And Bradstreet would be hiding behind the shutter and he would go, "Mew, mew, mew." And that was the sign that he had gin for sale. And what people would do, they'd have their little cup or their bottle and they'd hold it under the cat's paw, and they'd drop their coins through a little slot in the cat's mouth. And then Bradstreet would pour from the inside of the house, would pour gin through the spout, and it would fill up their glass, and that way they couldn't be informed upon. And they became to be called Puss and Mews, and they were so successful, and such a clever way for the gin sellers to sell gin that they sprang up all over London. And I'm very keen that we should bring back the Puss and Mew.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. Alex is back now. Sorry, Alex, I'll stop.
No problem at all. No problem. Thank you. Yeah. As Caroline's asked you about gin, I shall ask you about the little story that really interested me, and that would be pineapples.
Pineapples, yes. So pineapples were a huge sensation in 18th century London. When they first appeared, just people wrote about them in absolute raptures. But because there was no refrigeration, obviously, on the ships, most pineapples had a very short shelf life, and they were incredibly hard to grow in this country. So they were really, really expensive. It was cost about £80 to buy a pineapple. If you consider what I've just said about how a housemaid earned £5 in a year, that gives you an idea of quite how pricey a pineapple was. And they became a kind of social, like a status symbol for amongst the wealthy in London. Having one was like owning like the rarest Louis Vuitton handbag or something. People would have parties and they'd have their pineapples on display, and they quite often they didn't even eat them. They'd let them basically go rotten. They'd only eat them when they were like falling apart, because it was so good to have your pineapple on display. Because it was so good to have a pineapple, the pineapple growers started renting pineapples out to people as well. So for a guinea a night, you could rent a pineapple for your dinner party, but obviously you couldn't eat it or you'd lose your deposit. And even more, if you couldn't afford to rent a pineapple, people started selling wooden ones that were painted to look like a genuine pineapple, and you'd kind of have it on display, but maybe like have not too many candles burning so that people couldn't tell the difference, like a fake Louis Vuitton. So yeah, pineapples were a huge deal, and eventually, of course, people worked out how to grow them. An enormous expense. They had these great hot houses where they would have to burn coal the whole time to heat them, and expert pineapple growers would command these huge salaries because it was so hard to do.
If I'm right in saying, I think there's a pineapple on top of the Wimbledon trophy, I think. There
is, yes. And they were a really big thing. So you get them in lots of buildings, like finials on banisters, and there were dresses with pineapples on them. They became a real sort of cultural icon.
What other cultural icons did you consider using for your research but didn't have time to put it in?
Oh God, I'm always finding things that I can't really justify. I have like a folder where everything that I come across in my research that looks catches my eye and looks interesting, then I'll put it in my little folder, and hopefully, even if it doesn't make it into one book, it will make it into another. One of the things that little details that I come across in my research. So I set a scene in Daughters of Night in the Rag Fair, which was a very poor district of London near the Tower of London, where there were hundreds and hundreds of secondhand clothes shops and stalls, and I read that people would sell their clothes. Clothes were really expensive in Georgian London, and people would sell their clothes down there and buy sort of second, third, fourth hand clothes, and people didn't really throw clothes away because they were so expensive. So there would be clothes on sale that were kind of 200 years old, that were like from Tudor times, that were totally not the fashion, but that people were selling. And actors from the theatres would go down to the Rag Fair to buy, who were appearing in Shakespeare plays, and would buy these 200-year-old garments with their ruffs and everything, and would so that they could be genuine on stage. And I just found it incredible that in our kind of disposable society, where we throw anything with a tear in it or a button loose, we will throw away these days, quite how much people looked after and sold on their old clothes.
Absolutely. When you're talking about clothing the prostitutes in the book, you go into a lot of detail about what they wore as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it was part of the sort of the thing that prostitutes, certainly at the higher end, offered, was that they looked and dressed and spoke a lot of the time very much like ladies of high society. They learnt to emulate the ladies of fashionable society, and they wore incredibly beautiful fashions, just like the ladies of the day. And it could sometimes, in certain situations, be very hard to tell the difference, which is something I play on in Daughters of Night, because not only at the beginning is my the victim in my crime, she's at first mistaken for a lady but is in fact a prostitute, but later my main character Caro, who is herself a lady, attends a masquerade where the ladies are prostitutes. And it was, in order to do that, they had to spend an awful lot of money on those fashions, and those women, the high class prostitutes, they became celebrities of their day, and the newspapers would write about them. They would be the girl, they'd appear at the theatre with a duke or whoever, and men would fight duels over the favour of the most beautiful prostitutes, and pay them tens of thousands of pounds sometimes. So it's a kind of both economically and culturally, their role in Georgian society, it was a lot more complicated than I think sort of the popular portrayal sometimes has them. And I really wanted to kind of explore that world in all of its complexity.
In the book, you also look at it from the point of view of a third character who's looking to sell her virginity as well. It's an interesting character in the book.
Yes, that's my third point of view character, who is a young girl, a 15-year-old girl called Pamela, who is very poor and very beautiful, and wants to kind of set herself up for a life on the town by auctioning her virginity, which was a very common at the time. And I kind of wanted to explore what, the economic pressures that drove women then, and indeed now, into prostitution, and to have the sort of contrast between the women who have been prostitutes for a number of years and are coming to the end of their earning potential, and someone who is embarking upon that career, and the different pressures that they face and the different exploitation that they face.
Where did you find a lot of your research for Daughters of Night? Because at the end of Blood and Sugar, you actually talk about the research for about 8 minutes on the audiobook. So
yeah, I mean, I'm always I think my readers often ask me about this, and so I like to put a historical note so that people who have enjoyed the book and want to learn more about it can find those non-fiction books and read them themselves if they want to. And yes, I buy a lot of books about the 18th century, and I really enjoy those, and I get a lot from there. I get a lot of there's a lot of resources online now, which can be really, really useful. A lot of the things where previously you'd have had to go to archives, museum archives and libraries, you can now find a lot of that information online, which is brilliant. And yeah, so I read two books in particular about the sex trade that were brilliant. Were a book by Dan Cruikshank called The Secret History of Georgian London, which it was absolutely fascinating and gave me a lot of ideas for plot and subplot, the whole sort of classicism thread to the book about ancient Greece and Rome and myths, and how that tied into prostitution, all came from that book. And I also really enjoyed Hallie Rubenhold wrote a book called Covent Garden Ladies, which was the inspiration for Harlots, which has been on the TV quite recently, which is a really, really great insight into the lives of the women themselves, and these kind of lives. They led these sort of lives of celebrity, but incredibly kind of brittle, vulnerable life. That one minute they could be sort of the toast of the town and in all the newspapers and earning, you know, £10,000 a year, which was a huge amount at that time. And the next they could be, you know, on the streets, in the gutter. And so it was this kind of precarious but very gilded life, which I always found fascinating, fertile ground to explore in the book.
Classicism in art was interesting too. Have you always had an interest in art, or was it just this book that brought it out?
I think I've always had an interest in the classical world and the classics. So that was very much an interest. And I love the 18th century paintings because you can tell so much about an era by looking at how people wanted to portray themselves. And there's no better place to do that than in the paintings that they commission. You know, I don't think they're not representations of absolute fact, but they tell you how people wanted to be portrayed, what their what was their idea of beauty, what their clothes looked like, and the things they chose to surround themselves with. So yes, there is an artist in the book. His name is Jacopo Sagnetti. He's an Italian artist living in London, and he likes to paint both his clients, his wealthy clients, and some of the high society prostitutes as figures from Greek and Roman myths and legends. And he's loosely based on Joshua Reynolds, who himself painted a lot of the leading prostitutes in Georgian London, and he liked to paint them as goddesses or nymphs a lot of the time, and I just thought that was a wonderful detail. And so Agnetti's house, where the prostitutes sit and drink tea between their sittings, becomes a sort of place of intrigue in the book.
There's a lot of imagery which you go to, which is detailed, but you've got a picture of the party place that opens the book in your hardback, I think.
Yes, it's very beautiful end papers from the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens.
Yeah, I wondered why you decided to pick that image, because there must have been loads of images you could have gone for.
I think I quite wanted to give people an idea of what Vauxhall was like, because it was for about 200 years, it was the leading entertainment venue in the whole of Europe. It was famous worldwide, so one of the things that it allowed was a mingling both of the classes and of the sexes, because it was one of the few places where it was permissible for respectable women to go. And yet also it was, if you could save up enough to go, it was a shilling for entrance, so it was quite expensive, but it was still within reach of, you know, your average sort of middle class person, your labourer or your artisan could usually find a shilling to go. The food and drink was supposed to be exorbitantly expensive, but the actual entrance itself was quite cheap. And at the bottom of the garden were these sort of shady bowers and groves where it was, you know, the light was kept deliberately dark, and it was notorious place for assignations. So men would go and pick up prostitutes at Vauxhall and take them off to the bowers, but also lovers having secret affairs would meet and slip away to the bowers, and they acquired a real reputation as a sort of moral hazard in society. And the owners of Vauxhall had to tread a very careful line between, on the one hand, they didn't want their place to become too seedy because, they wanted the aristocrats and the Prince of Wales and people to attend there. But on the other hand, they also were savvy enough to know that it was a big part of the attraction for a lot of the people who went there. So they kind of trod this very careful line. But yes, the end papers in the hardback are really, really beautiful, and they give a really lovely idea of what Vauxhall was like.
When looking at the start of the book and how you opened it, how many times did you go over the opening where the body was found? Because that's always an interesting part for readers.
Oh, I mean, I rewrite every scene so many times. I write every sentence so many times. I'm a great perfectionist, and I still never get it quite as good as I want to. But yeah, I think the opening of the book is particularly important because it's the scene that grabs the reader and draws them in. So yes, many times is the answer.
Yeah, because when we first met, we were reading it out together as part of the William Shaw reading event, which is a very unique way of opening the book, because that was like an online launch as well.
Yes, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what was that like?
Oh, I think it's such a great event. So for those of you who don't know, what happens is about 20 people. They're called the reading party, and you all get given a small, 2 small extracts from the first couple of chapters of the book, and you don't know where your extract fits in the book, but you just have these 2 extracts, and you know what the one before is. And so you start out, the author reads the first extract, and then everybody reads their extracts in turn. And so you get a full picture of the first couple of chapters of the book. And it was great. It was, it's a lovely way for an author, because you hear people reading out your words. And it's, for me, it was just before my book was actually released for publication. So it was like it was the first time I'd kind of seen readers really engaging with it. And then that was fantastic. It was a lot of fun. It's a really original idea for an event.
I love it. I love going. What made you choose the parts you did? Because because we were reading for over half an hour, so you had to select which parts to read from.
Well, so as discussed, my book does alternate between the perspective of Caro and the perspective of Child, the thief taker, and the perspective of Pamela, the young prostitute. And so I obviously opened with Caro's first chapter, in which she finds the body. But then I skipped to the 3rd chapter because it was a direct follow-on from that scene. And I thought having Peregrine Child's first scene would give less of an idea of the sort of shape of the book. So we cut straight to the chase.
Yeah, it definitely worked. But Peregrine Child as a character is completely allows you to do a different style as a kind of private detective idea. But that must mean that you're influenced by the private detective genre, or is that just essence I've got from reading the book?
I like most people, those great, the Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe and all this, how can you not love those books? I wasn't sort of consciously, what I really wanted to explore was the role of the thief taker and the rather slapdash nature of the criminal justice system at that time, and the role of thief takers within that. And I liked the idea of the kind of mismatched duo, really, of Caro and Child, in that she's a very well educated, very rich, very beautiful, quite imperious woman who can appear quite cold, but I think that you know, that's mostly a form of protection. And then you have Child, who he's short and fat and slovenly and working class, and his chief dislike is rich beautiful people, and so they have a kind of spiky, but ultimately they come to respect each other and share a determination that these rich, arrogant men who are the suspects in this murder should be brought to justice, and so that brings them together.
He's very protective, isn't he? Because he can, as you say, he can go places where she couldn't, but even he was having problems. What was the hardest bit you got when writing his story?
Well, I think the problem with Peregrine Child is that he's quite morally compromised as a character, and I wanted to, just at the point where they are making breakthroughs in the case, I wanted that morally compromised nature of his life, and the things he has done in his slightly shady, dodgy past to be used against him. I won't go into too much detail because there's sort of spoilers here, but ultimately he is forced into taking some rather uncomfortable decisions that threaten to completely get in the way of their investigation, and I always, perfect characters bore me senseless. I don't know about you. I don't like a character. I like a character with flaws, and Child definitely has flaws.
When you were drawing on both characters of Blood and Sugar, what do you think you learnt in developing those characters between books 1 and 2?
That's a very good question. I guess I wanted to think about how the events of the first book would have impacted on those characters. I wanted to, but I also, because it's from different people's point of views, these are both characters in Blood and Sugar, but you never saw the world from their perspective in Blood and Sugar. You only saw them through Harry's perspective. And that's quite a significant difference, because how others see us is, of course, very different to how we see ourselves, and how we see them is very different from how they see themselves. And so I think that was very interesting as a novelist to explore those contradictions. I should also add, though, that although these books take place in the same world and have some of the same characters, it's not a series as such. I like to say that the books complement one another, but they can both entirely be read as standalone stories. You definitely don't need to have read one to read the other, and they work in any order. So they're companions rather than a series.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. What would you say that you got planned next? Because you said it was a standalone style. So
yes, it's a sort of I describe it as a kind of feminist Dickensian adventure. It has it's about a girl called Red, and Red is she believes she is the heir to a great fortune, which is in the hands of a very wealthy family called the de Lacys, and she believes she is the rightful heir and sets out to kind of claim her inheritance. And it's a kind of mystery as into what happened between her parents who eloped together, and also the kind of family secrets in this, which have a huge impact on her ability to find the evidence to say that she should be the rightful heir to this fortune. And Red is also a fortune teller. So there's a method of fortune telling that is very relevant to the plot. I look at like superstition in Georgian England and coming up against the ideas of the Enlightenment. And the method of fortune telling even informs the structure of the book in terms of like the chapters. And I can't say too much because my agent will kill me, but I'm really enjoying writing it, and it's a bit of a departure for me.
Sounds fascinating, because I always like inheritance and stuff. The 18th century, you could probably get loads of plots from that. What was it about the 18th century that made you decide to start writing from there?
I'd always been fascinated by the 18th century. I don't really know why, but I'd always been drawn to novels about that period and films and what have you. And then I studied a bit in university. I did courses. I did politics at university, but I did courses on 18th century history as part of my course. And then in my master's, I wrote about 18th century philosophy. So it was always of great interest to me. And I'd always loved historical crime novels and was really drawn to them. So it seemed to me a bit of a no-brainer when I decided to write a historical crime novel that it would be set in the 18th century. And one of the things I really love is about the 18th century is that you've got the flowering of all these ideas and ideals and philosophy, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, ideas about human rights and democracy and liberalism that underpin so much of our society today. So in that respect, it was it's very recognizable and very these are ideas we can appreciate and sympathize with the people who were trying to change the world. But on the other hand, the society itself was still, in many respects, incredibly brutal, and a society that we wouldn't recognize at all in terms of things like blood sports and slavery and a criminal justice system that could be so brutal, and grinding poverty and prostitution. And so I kind of, to me, that contradiction between those two worlds seemed a very fertile ground for writing crime novels.
What made you start with slavery as your first book?
I think it's a subject that and a part of our history that we don't talk about enough, that we don't engage with enough. It was absolute, it's so horrific and it's evil, and we're still very much living with the consequences of that evil today. And I like the idea of taking that part of our history to readers who might not necessarily read a non-fiction historical book, but would read a crime novel set in that time. And I've always been a very firm believer that crime novels are just as capable of exploring difficult subjects, difficult, disturbing subjects with as much insight and sensitivity as a literary novel or a non-fiction book. And so that's what I tried to do.
What were the crime novels that you read before you decided to write that influenced you in writing that style?
So I've always loved Andrew Taylor's books, and he's written novels that were set in the Regency period, and now he's writing in the 17th century. So I really loved his books. C.J. Sansom was a big influence on me. I love, there's a novel called An Instance of the Finger Post, which I love. David Liss's novels, which are kind of sort of bawdy, picaresque crime novels set in the 18th century, and his main character is actually a thief taker as well. There's a huge novel called The Quincunx, which is about a disputed inheritance, which was a wonderful, vivid descriptions of sort of early 19th century life. So there were a lot of great books. Oh, Antonia Hodgson, I should mention. If you like my books, you'll love her books, because they're also set in Georgian London, and they're fantastic.
I do like to read historical stuff. What do you think they teach other writers in other kinds of the genre when they discuss it? Because they seem to be very popular with the audience, and I think I know why. But what do you think they're so popular?
I think they're a really good way of exploring what society was like in another time. But when it's done well, historical fiction, I think it should never ever feel like a history lesson. It should feel like you are immersed in that world. And I think what a novelist can do that is harder to do in non-fiction, or at least I see it done well less often, is you can really understand the emotional pressures upon the characters and their emotional reactions to things. In some ways, I think that gives a really powerful and vivid portrait of what it was like living in a certain society at a certain time. And I think it's probably right now it's very popular because, particularly in lockdown, the present is not particularly alluring to read about, and that actually this kind of escapist world of the 18th century or wherever, I think I'm getting a lot of readers say to me it was wonderful to kind of lose myself in Georgian London, and sort of forget about the present.
When you're on panels with other authors, what do you like to discuss with them when the cameras are off?
Oh, that's a good question. We normally talk about the books we're currently writing and moan at each other about how, oh God, I've got so much still to do, or I'm in the middle of my edits. Oh God, we can moan a bit when the cameras are off. It's although we try not to, because obviously this is the best job in the world.
Yeah. I must admit, I really did enjoy your historical panel this week with the whole noir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about that for anyone?
Yeah, it was really good because we were all historical crime writers, but all writing really different books set in really different periods. So I was on there, Sarah Ward, who writes, she's the crime writer, but she writes historical novels as well as Rhiannon Ward. She was moderating, and then there was Kathy Unsworth, who had written a book which was set in the 50s, and actually round the corner from me. I'm in Maida Vale, but her book was set in sort of Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, and it was about a real life murder, a serial killer at the time. So it was kind of set in the world of like the sort of jazz clubs and the West Indian community in Notting Hill, and it sounds absolutely fascinating. I haven't read it, but I really want to. And then Ian Maguire, who I have read his novel North Water, which is just wonderful, and I think is going to be on TV soon. But his books are 19th century, and he wrote one set in Manchester. His new one is set in Manchester and is about Irish Republican groups operating in Manchester. They were called the Fenians, I think. And so it was just really, really interesting that we've all written books about very different topics, very different periods of time, and from the sounds of it, stylistically quite different books. And that's what's so fascinating. Like the broader crime genre, historical crime is equally just as varied, and people are doing new and innovative things all the time within the genre.
Are there any true life cases from the 18th century that you think, oh, I might want to try and use that in a book?
I've never thought about writing true crime myself, but quite often I read about events and they inspire me to. But I will never replicate it exactly. I'll always, I'll take things as inspiration, but I tend not to. There's a very interesting case which was about a girl who disappeared, and she disappeared for a week, and then she turned up again, and she claimed that she'd been kidnapped and held against her will in a house, and the authorities basically arrested some people, and there was a big trial, and it was a huge sensation. And then it kind of emerged that she was probably lying and had made the whole story up, and it became this huge controversy in Georgian society about who you believed. It was like, you have like kind of, I'm team Harry and Meghan, team William. This was like, did you believe this girl or did you not? And it really divided society. And I do think in the back of my mind that it would be quite an interesting case to explore in more depth in a novel, because it says so much about the things that we believe and the lies that people tell, and what people want to believe versus what the evidence says.
Yeah, because you asked about fake news during the whole festival, and you came up with a really interesting thing about saying that fake news existed back then too.
Yes, absolutely it did. The Georgians loved a conspiracy theory. If whoever your political enemy was, people would just make up lies and distribute them on pamphlets, and it could be very, they could be very damaging. As I would argue that sort of reputation then was a even more important and precarious thing than it is today. But yes, the slander sheets, which were illegal. So if you wanted to distribute newspapers or pamphlets, they should have been stamped by the authorities to say that you were allowed to distribute them. But there were lots of illegal pamphleteers who would print up whatever scandal, whatever bit of juicy gossip, some of which were true, some of which were entirely invented, usually in order to do in your political enemy or your business rival or your love rival or whoever. So yeah, fake news has been with us a very long time.
If you were to pick out a scene in the book that you would say that was your favourite bit to write, what would it be?
Oh gosh, that's a hard question. I mean, I like writing the endings of my books. I come up with my endings very early on, and most of the hard work of the book is working out how to get from my opening scene to my ending, and keep all the balls in the air and not drop them. So I writing the ending, because I always try to really pack a punch with the endings of my books, and I've waited a long while to get there. And so when I do, it's usually quite an emotional moment for me, both in terms of what's in the book itself and how I feel about it, because it's taken me such a long time.
Well, this one definitely did. It's very twisty.
Thank you.
When you started Blood and Sugar, what was the hardest bit in writing that you would advise new writers to avoid?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me, it was I when I was writing Blood and Sugar, when I first started, I didn't really struggle that much with the prose itself, but I did find shaping the book, the structure and plot of the book, it comes less naturally to me than the prose does, and so I spend a lot of brain power and a lot of energy making sure that the plot of the book is of the same quality and standard as the writing, and I put a lot of thought into planning and structuring my books.
What would you say you're looking forward to most about when we can go and do public events again?
Well, I really, really, really love these events. I like going to book launches and seeing my writer friends. I like going to festivals and meeting readers. And I've missed everybody. I want to hug everybody and drink wine with them. And I really, really want to meet readers in person again and get their questions. And I've had a whole book come out that I haven't seen in a shop. I really want to go to a bookshop and find my book in there, because I still find that really exciting.
What was it like when Blood and Sugar first came out in the shop?
It was amazing, absolutely amazing. I would, I'd go and just walking past any bookshop, I'd want to go in and find it. But it was particularly thrilling when the paperback came out, because it was the Waterstones Thriller of the Month. And so every Waterstones I went into had like a big display, and some of them had window displays, and that was like another level of brilliantness.
Yeah, it was nominated for so many awards, and deservedly so as well.
Thank you. It was incredible and very unexpected. It was lovely.
When coming up with a new idea, where do you generally start? Is it your research or just dreams or something?
So in my first two books, I came up with the subject first. So the first book of slavery and the second book about the sex trade, and but I also, around very early on, had the main characters in mind. In my crime novels, my main character, my victim, and the person that did the murderer, they are kind of early on, and those I think very hard about those relationships, and also theme is very important to me, like the theme of the book and how the theme relates to the main characters themselves. And really everything else kind of comes out of that. I usually then, when I've got those kind of basics, I think about the ending, where I want to get to. And then I do research. I usually research the topic in quite a lot of depth, and that gives me ideas for subplots and for other characters. A lot of my characters are either based on people who really existed, or are kind of amalgams of several people who really existed, and a lot of that comes out of my research. But often I'll do sort of 3 months planning before I start writing the book. I'm quite a planner.
I like to be a pantser myself. There's been challenging planning, but what would you say is the most enjoyable bit about the planning side of it?
I like it because I find it very freeing. So I have a big sort of stream of consciousness document where I'll write down things as they occur to me, or ideas, and a lot of them will fall by the wayside, but some of them are gold, and some of them will leap out at me at the minute I think of it. It's that I know that will be in the book. And So I really enjoy that stage of just letting your mind go, what if. I hate the first draft with an absolute passion, and then I adore editing my work and polishing it and making it good. So I basically start off in a really happy place, and then I go, oh my god, I've got blank page, and I have this horrible, excruciating bit where I have to write a first draft, and then I'm in a really happy place where I get to make everything pretty and sharpen the dialogue and bring the settings to life and all that. It's like being able to take an exam again and again and get a better score each time.
Oh, I love the setting, and I'm just thinking about like all the period dramas that are on. If it was to be put like as a Netflix series, say Bridgerton, who would you put as the characters?
This is a good question. I think Caro would have to be, or maybe Rachel Weisz could play Caro.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
She's very good. And then for child, that's a tough one actually. I haven't got a character in mind for child. Harry, I think maybe, is it Ewan Griffith? I think when he was in kind of Hornblower in his kind of sexy uniform, I think he could be.
That's ironic because I'm just watching it at the moment. I love it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What will you be watching as a break for when you don't write?
What? Sorry, what was that?
What will you be watching as a break for when you don't write? What do you watch on telly?
What do I watch on telly? Oh, I'm going to be watching the new Line of Duty, definitely. I loved. I did enjoy Bridgerton. I thought it was a lot of fun, even though it's very, very different to my my books. Basically, I love all the crime dramas that are on. I think when they're done well, they're brilliant. I like The Crown as well. That's another weakness of mine.
I do like to watch lots of TV online. But I'm going to end by just saying thank you so much for coming tonight, and hopefully to see you in the flesh soon.
I'd love to, and thank you so much for having me on. And hopefully we'll be able to have a glass of wine together before too long.
Hopefully at Harrogate, if you're going to be there.
Harrogate, I will definitely be there. I've even booked my hotel in a fit of optimism.
Yeah, I've still got mine from the year before. I rolled it over. Yeah. So hopefully I'll see you there. And thanks everybody.